My name is Lena. I work for an organization called Kvinna till Kvinna. That's Swedish for woman to woman. And I have actually an awesome panel. And I am, you know, really humble being the moderator of this fantastic panel. We have decided not to go through the bios. The bios are in your packs and they are on the wall in order not to lose time. You know, you would have to accept the fact that they are awesome. And then do your... Yes, exactly. Exactly. Anyway, what I will do is I will just briefly provide some the frame for what we will talk about. And after the Cold War, conflicts grew more complex. But we also, at the same time, saw an increased engagement of civil society in peace building. And nowadays there are solid evidence that peace processes, peace deals, are more sustainable if they are inclusive. That is, if more stakeholders are involved than just the warring parties, just warlords power brokering at the table. There are evidence to this from the Mozambique peace accords in the 1990s. A lot of women's organizations involved there. Liberia, of course, is the big example. And being here in Belfast, of course, the Good Friday Agreement with the Women's Coalition at the table is an example of this. Even though Patricia, mentioned earlier that peace is not only the absence of violence, it is also the presence of justice, as she pointed out. So on one level, there is a sort of understanding of, we also got, of course, the Security Council Resolution 1325 that gives us leverage, at the highest level. But so on one level, there is a sort of understanding among world leaders that new security challenges like rising inequalities within societies, climate change, human rights abuses, requires new and more complex policy responses. But at the same time, the war on terror has been a setback for human security, conflict prevention and peace building, and it's called by some a decade lost for human rights and women's security. We have seen the rise of militarism, a shift back to militaristic solutions, and astronomic levels of military spending that takes away resources from other more pressing needs. And I know that WILPF has done some counting examples of, we have an average on global military spending on 1,700 billion US dollars a year, and that equals 700 years of regular UN budgets. That's 700 years. And I happen to be a defender of the United Nations, actually, Judy. So we see new and more complex security challenges that are demanding new and complex solutions. But the solutions that our leaders still end up with seem to be quite old-fashioned and militaristic. And we're stuck in some kind of world schizophrenia, if you will. So Valerie, Hudson, you and your colleagues have established from data that there is a link between state security and women's security. And the larger the gender gap in a country, the more likely a country is to be involved in conflict. So could you give us some examples of this connection, this link? And does this fact, this link, also offers new solutions to prevent conflict?
Thank you. I really appreciate being invited to this conference, and I'm grateful to be on this panel. I think my presence here is to establish that there are some new tools out there, some that we may not even be aware of. My own research as an academic focuses on the relationship between the security of women and then the security of their nation states. I'm an academic, and yet I guess I'm here to suggest what academia can contribute to what we're here to do, and also, in a sense, how academic work itself can be a form of activism. My field of study is security studies, and especially in the United States, where I come from, security studies is a very male-dominated field. And as I began to search my heart, I began to realize that there were things that were not being said in security studies because it was so male-dominated. And so my intention was to explore this link between the security of women and the security of states. And the first example that I started to research was the highly abnormal sex ratios in China and India, and making the case that actively culling girls from the population, to the extent that women worldwide are no longer half of humanity. Mm-hmm. There are now 101.4 males on this planet for every 100 females, and it should be 98 males per 100 females on the planet, given women's greater longevity. And that's a man-made phenomenon, and nothing natural about the fact that women are now less than half of humanity. So we were able to show very robustly that there was in fact a linkage between the degree to which girls had been taken or culled from the population and instability and violent crime and even localized rebellion. And so that was our first foray. After that, and its success, because the book was very successful, we then wanted to examine this relationship more broadly. And to do so, we needed data, and we needed a lot of data, because what I have found, at least in the American academic community, is that you must have a particular style of large N aggregate statistical analysis in order to be taken seriously. And so we set out to do just that, because we knew it should be taken seriously. So one of the first things we did is we began to compile the largest compendium of information on the status of women available anywhere in the world. And it's called the Woman Stats Database, and it's free and it's online. And I brought this so that you could get the URL. So we have information on over 300 variables for women, not just quantitative. Don't think of this simply in terms of numbers, but also qualitative information on what's going on with women in the world, what the laws are, what the practices are, and what the prevalences are. We also develop innovative scales and innovative mappings, and this 10-year exercise in creating this resource enabled us to finally put together all of our research on the relationship between what's going on with women and what's going on with security. And our publisher loved our title. I think you will too. Sex and World Peace. What more could you want in a title? And for example, we were able to show empirically that the best predictor of whether a nation would be involved in intra and interstate conflict was not its level of democracy, not its level of wealth, and not other variables that one might consider to be part of the security studies, but rather the level of violence against women within the society. That was the best predictor. And democracies that had high levels of violence against women acted just like non-democracies that had high levels of violence against women. And we've used this research to try to develop and articulate what we call an R2PW framework. And I bet you can guess what the W is for. The notion that the oppression of women and the subjugation of women must be attended to by the international community as one of the deep roots of aggression and violence. And I hope to be able to talk to you about that further. I'll just end by saying our latest project is to ask about the role of the state, especially the role of powerful women in the state to advance the causes of women and peace. In my own country, we've had 4 years under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and there could be no more candid exponent of how women and peace are linked. The question that we're trying to address in this book, and I invite any of you who have opinions to come talk to me, and about whether she was able to make a difference or not. So I look forward to interacting with the members of the panel further on these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. Amina Mama, you come from, you have just met African heads of state, and I wonder, do they talk about the fact that we can see that, that war rhetoric strengthens prejudice and traditional gender stereotypes? Is that anything that is on their agenda? Or you have done research in this area? So
I'll just go start right up by saying what a relief it is to be here. And take a deep breath. I wouldn't say I was talking with them. I was given a very brief few minutes, thanks to the fact, talking of women leadership, that we now have the first ever woman chairing the African Union, and the whole African Union has been celebrating its 50th anniversary, and we also have for the first time 2 presidents. So there's a lot we could talk about in terms of women in power and what they can do, but one of the things the Honorable Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma did was create a space for 3 non-presidents to address Africa's heads of states, and for some arbitrary, obscure reason of her own, I was asked to be the woman who did that, along with a youth who was also a woman, and a diasporan brother, the former PM of Jamaica. But that's another little story. Is there a link? Well, the link is very, very clear. The difference between this room and that could not be more extreme. We're having conversations here. You don't have conversations at that level. So maybe that's a good point to start with, the meaning of the state and the meaning of state power. One of the questions you asked was, do we need to change gender identities, men's gender identities? Well, of course, but I don't think that's the issue. I think that's the symptom. If we look at the history of statecraft and political power in the Western liberal democratic tradition, which is as good as it's got so far, then we see that the definition of a state required, you were defined as a state if you had a standing army, and if you didn't, you were not even a state. We know this because in Africa there were many non-militarized polities and less hierarchical modes of power, and they were disparaged as primitive and acephalous. So what I'm saying is that this thing, this gendered division, this social sexual contract is at the heart of the meaning of government, at the meaning of state. So we may want to change prejudice, we may want to change, particular manifestations, but they're symptomatic. The core is structural. So at some point, whatever else we do, we have to confront that, because it does suggest a very different strategy. A lot of the strategies that we're all working on, for very good reason, are coping with the consequences of the unequal gender politics that govern the world. And in any seat of power, it looks intransigent. No, they aren't changing. They're not changing fast enough. So bringing women in is one strategy, but I would say that's the least we can do. And even the head of the African Union, like 15, 20 years ago, said, "Parité, ça c'est le premier étage." That is just the first step. Well, 20 years after he said that, although the African governments are committed to gender parity, it's still nowhere near there, even though we've got a few things to claim. So in relation to the whole issue of violence and militarism and gender identities as we know them are co-constitutive. So what we have is a dynamic where people's identities and subjectivities are formed in such a way that they're invested in sustaining. It's very hard to become different as a man, as a woman. And as you know, it's not just men who need to change, because the whole thing is based on a heteronormative bifurcation. So the men will be the heroes and the national heroes and wield the flags and the guns, and the women will be the protected, those who are fought over and fought for, and who are currency between battles between men. This is patriarchy. There's nothing new about it, and I don't think anything less than totally radical solutions will actually undo this. We're all embedded in it. So we can start change wherever we want and do whatever kinds of work we want. That's in there. And in terms of, if I can just go back to speaking as an African thinker, this state system was introduced at colonialism. Colonial rule was military rule. And by the time Africa became independent, it was already fully militarized, not just having been colonized, but also because of the militarization that accompanied the things that still position Africa where it is today. The massive conscription and recruitment of African men to fight in imperial wars and to suppress their own populations. People's armies came as a result of the liberation struggle, but the conventional format of African states derives from the same social sexual contract and manifests in an even more militarized form because of our location as sites of descent from empire and from current capitalism and global power. Those fundamental positionings are still very much in place. So I'd say gender is at the heart of politics, at the heart of statecraft, and it has particularly extreme manifestations in countries that have been colonized. So you know, that's probably a good place to start. We also have anti-colonial military traditions, which we call liberation movements. I think that the fact that the liberation movements were so much empowered by the returning veterans meant that they also have this very militarist element, and we've seen that in the internal stuff, the internal sexual politics of even the most progressive of our liberation movements. And feminists in Africa have been challenging that romanticization. In the West, you love those pictures, women freedom fighters with a baby and a gun. I'm yet to see the man with a baby, that stuff. So we can't afford to be romantic about even radical militarism, radically progressive militarism anymore, because in the post-colonial era, in the context of the global war on terror, things are more dangerous and more invidious than they have ever been. So there's more peace talk, there are more resolutions, there are more policies, but the fundamental link-up between transnational capital, corporate interests, and militarism, including the role of our nation states in facilitating the corporate land grabbing. And I've done some work in the Niger Delta. Go there and see what happens to people when you have that link up between transnational corporations with their local allies, the global war on terror with its local militaries. We have to dismantle them concurrently and simultaneously if we're going to actually change, because as long as we chip away at one piece, the other piece is going to keep it stoked. So we really need to take a look at those connections and work out how to sever them, how to sabotage them. And for me, that involves the kinds of things many of us are doing, which is working to empower women, both with the analytic capacity and the political strategies, so you can work at all the different levels of the current edifice of complicity in male power and violence. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think this beautifully leads on to Madeline and you know, talking a little bit about the fact that we do have a discourse today also that that shows that the increasing gaps within countries and within societies between rich and poor is not only a threat to the individual security, but it's a national security threat and also, I would say, a global security threat. I mean, for instance, in Europe we see today growing right-wing extremism really tearing apart the fabric of society. At the same time, the Arab Spring was an uprising against social inequality for dignity, so it could also be challenged in a positive way. Now, my question to you is, what challenge does this pose for the women's peace movement? This is not really classical kind of disarmament work or 1325 issues, or is it? Is it, Madeline?
I would say yes, and I say yes because I was just thinking back to what would the women who founded the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, what would the discussions they would be having then, in a time where women didn't have the vote, where there was colonialism rampant, where there was militarism, there was British imperialism, and it was all based on a scramble for resources and based on the scramble for other people's countries with those resources, and necessitating the creation of a type of masculinity that was prepared to go off and fight for something that it didn't even have a stake in having because of the social inequalities that existed. So their conversations would have been pretty much the ones that we're having now, just contextually different. And you think of the analysis that they put forward, which is very much that we have to look at root causes. We have to look at the economic causes of conflict, the distribution of wealth, the inequalities that the failures of equality were actually bringing, and the discriminations that then flowed from that. And if you're looking at that, you then got to look at militarization, and you have to look at arms, the sale of arms, and their use. And one of the things they said was that under no circumstances must nation states allow the privatization of arms industries because, well, you can see what happened as a result. So their analysis was absolutely right. And yes, huge strides were made forward because they were then pushing for a belief in a multilateral system, to actually create the League of Nations, to create the United Nations. And yes, we know they have failed in so many areas on so many occasions, but they are still there, and we are still able to influence them. Does it make a difference now? Is that context sufficiently difficult that we have to rethink how we orientate ourselves towards peace? I think it does. It gives us opportunities as well as obstacles. One addition that I think has been really well articulated now by Amina is we have to look at masculinities. The creation of violent masculinities and gender as a structural problem is absolutely crucial to being able to maintain patriarchy and capitalism without borders and without the sort of legal constraints that are absolutely necessary. So what we need to be looking at is how do we join all these things together? How do we not look, as we have been, we've been examining things like the nuclear threat, we've been examining arms trade, we've been examining violence against women, but we haven't been so great at actually putting them all together and looking at how the whole map is fitting together and what we need to do to make those changes. Now we do know. We know much, much better how the system works. We understand much better how to, if you like, deconstruct some of the things that we are facing and what those would be. So, for example, if you look at what's going on in the United Kingdom now over this death of Lee Rigby and the response to that, it has been automatically used by the media to reflect a violent masculinity from Islamicists, a violent masculine response by nationalists, and there's been no other narrative. We now know that is entirely wrong. If we just turned the lens round and looked at it from the position of the woman on the bus who got off the bus to try to stop it and actually talk to the man and what happened after that, and what was said that, you know, they're not representing religions anyway, but they've been caught up in a national, they're both sets have been, of men have been caught up in a type of nationalist identification because they don't have another one. And that's all predicated on, to be a man, you've got to have something. So that feeds into the violent masculinities construction, and that becomes just the story, and it's not the truth. And one of the things that we must be looking at is actually opening that space to have the conversations that need to be had about looking at social and economic equality, looking at how that plays into austerity and what we need to be doing about it, looking at how laws regulate, including international law, could and must be used to ensure that we regulate that type of austerity from a human rights perspective, looking at discriminatory impacts on those, looking at how the arms industry, in particular the nuclear arms industry, actually takes money, sucks money out of the economy, which should be used for progressive social and economic rights realizations, and then look at the impact that has on men and women, because there is a differential impact. And then understanding all of those things, we can put them back together and move to a much more peaceful way of actually addressing those inconsistencies in terms of how democracies should move forward. And I've been poked, so I have to be quiet now for a moment.
We will come back. Helen Mack. We're covering different grounds here, as you can see, to weave this complex weave of our current society. Helen Mack, from your dedicated and successful fight against impunity and for the rule of law in Guatemala, can you see a dilemma between, on the one hand, making peace and on the other hand, pursuing justice? Is there a dilemma? How to reconcile the short-term need to include political leaders, militaries, warlords, soldiers who possibly committed war crimes and atrocities in peace agreements with the long-term necessity for justice and the rule of law to make peace sustainable? Is there a dilemma?
Yes, there is a dilemma, especially when in a country like ours, the control of the political system and the institutions are dominated by discrimination, racism, classism, sexism. So even though institutions exist, if they are under control, and sometimes when people that become citizens in order to exercise our rights and we start playing the rules, they will kick the table to us. So I started in the middle of the conflict. My sister was murdered September 11th of 1990, and started accusing the intelligence system of being responsible for my sister's murder. And they were telling me, how do I dare to accuse the army in the middle of the conflict? But we kept, and it was the first case before the justice system. And then we start raising issues, what we call the mechanism of impunity. So we start putting in evidence all those mechanisms that they were distorting, they were manipulating the justice system, but at the same time, how the military were also threatening us, and like we have to shut ourselves, and that meant also to judges, to police. The police who made my sister's investigation was murdered also. 3 of them had to go into exiles. I had more than 30 judges. 2 of them went into exile, and all the witnesses also went into exile. But that was the first case, and after that, 7 other cases more of human rights came into the justice system, including the genocide. But in the midst of my sister's case, also the peace process started. So we had to sit before with the military and start talking about how to drop the military tribunals, the no amnesty, so we call the so-called reconciliation law. We also start making proposals for the national security law, the change of the intelligence system that has not to be only monopolized by the army, that has to be democratic controls. Also, we're trying to make the links, because in this transition, that sometimes we always talk by transitions, it takes more time than what the transition is. So we are 20 years in transition, and the transition never finished. So we start making the link between how the organized crime and these factors of power that are controlling the system are linked. So we also did a proposal for the UN, for the International Commission Against Impunity. And of course, I know that there are many people that are defending United Nations, and I know that's the only institution that even we don't like it, it's there, but they are also responsible for many other things that other countries will also lose opportunities because they don't want troubles in the country, and they become mediocres. I'm sorry if I'm being very, very tough with the UN, but sometimes we need tough institutions too, because we are the ones who lose. And I'm sorry if I'm very strong. I understand that we need United Nations, but there are many things that we have to change there too. So, yes, we sit on the table with the perpetrators, and as I said, when they don't like, they kick the table. That's what happened with the genocide case. In the genocide case, it was like how indigenous people dare to tell us that it was a genocide. And since the very beginning, the strategy was not to talk about genocide, not to talk about justice. It was, you are not able to talk about genocide. But what we gained with the genocide case is that at least 3 months ago, just 3 months ago, the military and the economic sector were denying that there was genocide. Even though they were denying human rights violations. At least at the end of the trial, they start saying, okay, we had human rights violations, but not genocide. But then the overturn of the conviction that we had this Monday. Because why? Because they're still controlling, I know they're still controlling the system, and they don't like citizens with rights playing the games of the rules of the games.
Thank you. Oh, do you see this panel is awesome, and I just hate to interrupt them. I think that we have now mapped out various aspects of how complex, you know, the peace and security landscape that is facing us, how complex it is. I just wanted to ask all the panelists here, do we work in the correct, are there any gaps in the way that the women's movement are working today? And are there any easy gains for us, you know, to move forward? I know it's, so I'll start with, well, let's start with Madeline. Rees.
Gaps, yes, there are many. And I think that we've said a lot about the United Nations system, but I think that what we need to do is we need, I was going to say reclaim, but we've never had it. So why don't we claim our space in the United Nations so that it actually works? There is a system. It doesn't work, but it could work. What if, for example, we took Valerie's amazing research as an indication of when there are problems about to arise in specific countries, and then we applied that in human rights terms to what the mechanisms should be doing to respond. So in other words, if your country is not respecting its human rights obligations, other countries have an obligation to assist, not to come in and militarize your country, but to come in and give assistance. And they use a leverage of economic power, political power, financial power, and other, and that's law, in order to basically twist your arm so you start doing better. Now, that's an ideal, because we don't trust other governments to do it, but if we are working with our governments to do it, then we actually have a start. If you have a monitoring mechanism, which we do in the Human Rights Council, which we do through the human rights treaty bodies, we have a forum where we can bring women to come and tell them what is really happening and to demand that they respond appropriately. Now, we've started to do that. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, we have started to do that. We are beginning to get responses which actually are commensurate with what is really happening on the ground. If we can get women there, like Julienne, to come and talk about the real grassroots experience of what's really happening, and we can turn that into human rights language and have good adjudication, and it goes back down again for implementation, we're changing the narrative, which is so important. And we're beginning to fill some of the gaps. So we can make the link between the nuclear expenditure and the austerity cuts, and have that adjudicated upon. We can make the link with countries that are purchasing vast quantities of small arms and others and using them to perpetrate violence against women and gender-based violence. We make those links, we draw it into the public domain, and we have it adjudicated. It's a long, slow process. It's not a quick fix, but there are other ways in which we can use that and spread it more quickly. Once the process has started, it will accelerate. And I just want to say another thing that is more of a quick fix in the short term now, and that is William Hague's initiative. There is this G8 declaration, you know, the forces of all evil got together, but they said the right things. And in saying the right things, they have given us an opportunity to say to them, for example, you said that women must be participant in peace negotiations. Get the Syrian women to Geneva for the peace talks. If you do not, then what was the point in signing that? Your ink's not even dry yet. So those are the things that we should be doing, is picking up on good, solid initiatives and making sure that they're not just worthless bits of paper, but they are actually implemented. And that's something we can all work together. Another last point, because I know we're running out of time, is that I think it's become very, very clear that no one can just work alone. We can't just have fantastic women's organizations, human rights defenders in Guatemala and elsewhere, trying and trying and trying on their own to deal with a problem in a nation state. We now need that international solidarity, which is what the Sandinista women said to me all those years ago when they packed me off to become an international lawyer. We need to have the international solidarity and understanding amongst women so that we can consolidate it at home and we are not forgotten. And I think that's a message that is still valid.
Absolutely. Amina? Yes.
Okay.
Why not?
Gosh, we all do so much, and we all work so hard. Your question's tough. What are we not doing? I don't think it's what we're not doing, and I don't think listening to even this kind of conversation, it's not what we don't know, it's not what we don't see, it's the disconnects. You know, women are weavers. We are very good at building the picture, building the map, and making the links that have the potential to subvert the tyrannies of our day. So it's not a question that we lack vision. It's not a question that we're not trying. It's the disconnect. I mean, I can speak probably personally on this. It's virtually impossible to mobilize resources for the kinds of work that we want to do. And I say that personally because I spent years and years trying to get tiny little grants to do what I think are radically subversive projects in specific locations and then connect them up, for example. But also in another capacity, I chaired the board of the Global Fund for Women for a number of years. Out of all the money for women in the world, something like 80% of it was relying on that one philanthropic whose annual budget was minuscule in global terms. So once you look at it systemically and structurally, you look at the amount of pitiful crumbs of funding that UN Women has compared to the rest of the UN system, UNDP. So we can amplify, we can work our guts out, but bottom line, we have to get better at making power answer us. They like the talk, they borrow the talk. I mean, I experienced it just the other day. I mean, one of our presidents accused me of being an unguided missile, summoned me to be guided to the palace, and proceeded to appropriate 3/4 of what I had said in his own speech. So this is an everyday dynamic. It doesn't matter which level you're at, from the top to the bottom. These dynamics of they're perverse dynamics. So I mean, I think the one of the biggest things we need to do is find better ways of doing what we're doing, and this kind of connecting work is very, very important. So I think it's not that we have to do something profoundly different. I think we know a lot more, and we're getting much better at what we're doing every single day. So quick fixes, to your question, it really does depend on your location and what level you want to intervene at. I can think of different quick fixes depending whether you're talking at the level of interstate and state organizations or at grassroots level.
Give us one then.
For me, the big one is really, I really believe in taking things down from below. So I really think that for me, the quickest fix is to work on grassroots women's security. Because if you work on that properly, you affect everything else. So that's why I would like to see a lot more of those transnational feminist initiatives which don't just go and document and gather the statistics, but teach women how to use those tools in situ on a regular basis, and then, you know, keeping those networks between those that level and the national level and the international level alive and vibrant. And, you know, all that requires resources. So I don't want anyone to get away with mouthing our narratives anymore without putting some money behind it, which is what they're doing. Presidents say wonderful things in Africa. Some of our worst presidents have the most beautiful narratives. They're liars if they don't put their money there.
Well, thank you. I think that was that was clear enough. Valerie?
Yeah, there were the two areas that I thought of. As being here at the conference, I think that one of these small disconnects may be disconnect between what academic researchers are doing and what folks like Madeline and Lena and Amina and, you know, what everyone is doing. And if academic researchers can be of use in the data they compile and the analysis that they do, You know, I'm writing a book that's already under contract to Columbia University Press. What a great forum for putting out there some of the ideas that you have. So I think that might be an interesting thread that should be woven. The second thing that I thought of was actually inspired by what Lena Gabawi said yesterday. And she said that one of the things that we need, I think, is more engagement with religions. And I think that's very true. Being a religious woman myself, part of what I do as an activist is to bring my own faith community to emphasizing peace and equality for women. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it that religion is offering that makes it such a powerful force? And it offers meaning for life. It tells us who we are. It tells us where we come from and where we're going. It tells us the difference between good and evil. And I think those who believe in peace and women's role in building peace must turn our religious communities in that direction, and that means active engagement with them. I mean, where else can you find eminent men telling our young men who they should be in order to have honor within their culture, right? These religious figures, I think, are critically important to deconstructing the toxic masculinities that we've spoken about here. So that's the second thing that I would like to see.
Helen.
Yeah, I think that, as it has said in this panel, in the creation of this masculinity issue and how to connect all of this and how women can also be working on the ground in security issues, as Valerie was saying, it's an issue that it's dominant for men, and then we have women's working in research or more academic, but very little women's working on the ground. And this is important, women's working on the ground, because men will usually misrespect those who just are theoretical and they haven't lived on the ground what it means to live or working on the ground. So, for example, in 2009, I was asked by the president to be part of the Police Reform Commission. So I worked on that. At the very beginning, the policemen were laughing and making fun of us because I was a woman and who I was. But the aim of the police reform was trying to change precisely the mentality of security. Instead of being repressive and reactive, to become more in prevention, trying to include the gender issue, and also that, because sometimes women are very duras, they are very hard. Also with the same women working in the ground because they want to reaffirm their self-esteem. So all of these issues, it has to be work. So this gap start diminishing, and trying also that men has to become an ally for women in this creation of a masculinity.
Thank you. Okay, we're wrapping up here soon. I know we're trying to solve the world problems here in 50 minutes, but I think you're doing a fantastic job, I must say.
Sorry, mischievous thought.
That's okay. Yeah. So I'm going to give you a last question before we're ending this, and the last question to all of you, short answer. If there would be a truly feminist state, would this state have a military organization, an army, weapons production, military spending? Why don't you start, Helen? Short.
Of course, but I would say no, but I think it's una utopia. How do you say utopia?
Yeah.
It's a utopia.
Utopian.
It's a utopia because it is, well, yeah. It's an utopia because we have to be convinced that as also this morning was said, there is the whole world, I think, because of the globalization, is a lot of greedy for money, greedy for power, and that also means that there is no ethics. So war, the colonization still remain. Now they're going to our countries for the natural resources, and new wars start coming. So on that sense, it's very hard to believe that countries will not have security issues in this.
Okay, thanks. Valerie.
Well, if it was a feminist world, I'd say no. But if you're a feminist state surrounded by non-feminist states, I think there's no alternative. Even for just defensive defense, as we talk about in security studies, you would need that. But I think the key, there's some great key, there's some great vision that most of our people, and especially our militaries, don't have, which is the notion that there is a war going on that underlies all other wars, and that's a war against women. You know, I woke up this morning, maybe it's the beautiful surroundings, I actually woke up this morning with a dream in my head. When I was younger, I was very much affected by the extremely long film called Shoah. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And I thought, we need a Shoah for women. We need to understand that this is a worldwide war against women, and if we win that war, the other wars will fade. As Shirin Ebadi said yesterday, the child who grows up seeing violence in their home cannot choose nonviolence. Right? We must provide alternatives, and I think part of that is providing the lenses to see reality, see beyond the illusions, and see the reality of what's going on.
She actually said that today, not yesterday. Amina,
Yesterday.
give us the...
You said we could only have one word, and my word
I know,
was
but...
no.
So, no explanation to no, just no. Shortish.
The real security for Africans, an old, late friend of mine called Claude Ake once said, is security from freedom, ignorance, poverty, and disease. His plane mysteriously fell out of the air and he was killed not long after, partly because although he was an academic, he was involved with the oil delta, so there's still a great suspicion over how his death. But his definition, you'll recognize it as feminists, because the way women redefine security is in terms of security from violence, security over our own bodies, our physical integrity, and from then, from that most intimate, all the way up through to the macro politics of global military spending. 10% of the global military budget last year could have fulfilled the Millennium Development Goals for the entire human population. Now, what is going on with this? I mean, it's not that we're utopian, it's they are completely dystopian. And they're so traumatized by their own histories of violence that they can't even think beyond it. I think we can definitely think about a world. In fact, I asked Africa's presidents to consider that you do not need national armies. They're talking about building a regional army, but in the meantime, let's work on dismantling and divesting the military budgets at local level, because most of Africa's debt was incurred through military deals between boys. Discredited dictators and US arms producers accrued the African debt that people are now supposed to be paying for. So the injustice, both historic and present, the concurrent ongoing injustices have to be interrupted. And I think we know this. We need to redefine security and basically put people at the center of it. And the whole paradigm, the narrative has shifted. The whole paradigm would shift if we put people before corporate profit, market, and all these other interests that are currently prevailing. Put people first. That includes women and men. Some of my best friends are men and religious. But put people at the center.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think if we do ever reach the utopia of a feminist state, we'll have won anyway, because we're not going to get there until the men vote for a feminist state. So we will have done all the things that we're doing now. We will have been successful, and it may only be 10 years ago, but 10 years in the future, you never know. But if we did, then that would be it. And the reserve position, massive doses of estrogen in the water, and then...
Okay, with this a kind of, I don't know, a statement of what we can expect in the future, we will close this panel. I'm not intending to do a summary of what has been said up here, but it will serve as an inspiration, I'm sure, for the days to come. So thank you so much, and thank you, awesome panelists. Yeah.